Okay, so you want to own a scrapyard, find a piece of land, pile up some old cars and busted metal, pay people a little, sell the stuff for more. Sounds almost too simple, almost insultingly simple, like the kind of business a 10-year-old could sketch out on a napkin. And that is exactly the problem. Because the scrapyard business is one of those industries where the surface looks completely dumb and obvious, and the inside looks nothing like what you imagined. The people who get rich from it don't get rich because they figured out something complicated. They get rich because they figured out that something everyone else dismissed as simple is actually extraordinarily difficult to do well, and they were the ones willing to do it. Here is what the scrap industry actually looks like. The United States scrap metal recycling sector generates roughly $40 billion in revenue every year. It employs over 30,000 people in more than 500 facilities across the country. And the businesses that have cracked the formula, the ones that sort fast, buy smart, and ship at scale, quietly generate millions of dollars in annual profit. Not on some glamorous product, on other people's garbage. But making serious money from junk is far more complicated than simply buying metal and selling it. So let's actually go inside. First, understand what you're dealing with. A scrapyard is not a junkyard in the Hollywood sense. A dusty chaos of broken lawnmowers and rusty bicycles. A real commercial scrapyard is an industrial materials recovery facility. It buys raw materials from the world and converts them into industrial feedstock. What comes through the gate? Almost everything. End-of-life vehicles, cars, trucks, buses, trailers, structural steel from demolished buildings, copper wire stripped from construction projects, aluminum from old window frames and engine blocks, brass from plumbing fixtures pulled out during renovations, old computers, servers, and consumer electronics, industrial machinery, pumps, motors, gearboxes, stamp presses, stainless steel equipment from restaurants and food processing plants, lead-acid batteries from cars and forklifts. Almost every object that civilization produces is eventually made of metal, and almost every one of those objects ends up somewhere. That somewhere is your yard. Now, the single most important thing to understand before you buy so much as a shovel. Not all metal is the same, and the differences in value are enormous. There are two worlds in scrap metal: ferrous metals, which contain iron, and non-ferrous metals, which don't. Ferrous metals are your steel and iron. I-beams from buildings, rebar from concrete, old car frames. They're magnetic, they're heavy, and they're everywhere. Because iron is one of the most abundant elements on Earth, ferrous scrap is the cheaper commodity. Right now in the United States, a ton of steel scrap sells for somewhere between $350 and $550. Depending on quality and grade. You make money on ferrous by volume. You need to move enormous amounts of it. Non-ferrous metals, copper, aluminum, brass, nickel, lead, are a different game entirely. They don't contain iron, they don't rust easily, and they conduct electricity. That makes them far more valuable per pound. Clean copper wire with no insulation on it currently fetches somewhere north of $3 per pound. Aluminum extrusions from old window frames bring 60 to 90 cents per pound. Brass plumbing fixtures land around $1.80 to $2.40 per pound. Compare that to steel, where you're working with fractions of a cent per pound. 1 pound of clean copper is worth about 30 to 40 times more than 1 pound of steel scrap. Let that sink in. This is why the mix of what you're buying and processing matters more than almost any other single variable in the business. Now let's talk about what it actually costs to get into this business, because most people get this completely wrong. The mental model most people carry is, buy some land, get some equipment, open the gates. Simple. Here is what actually happens. To open a legitimate commercial scrapyard in the United States, you are not looking at one type of cost. You are looking at 4 separate categories of cost that hit you before you process your first pound of metal. The first is land. You need industrial land, heavy industrial zoning, sometimes called M2 or M3 in most American cities, that's large enough to operate. For a functional mid-sized yard, you need somewhere between 5 and 15 acres. In a rural part of the country, that land might cost you $100,000. In an urban industrial zone near a major city, where you actually want to be, because that's where the supply of scrap concentrates, you're looking at $500,000 and beyond, just for the land. The second is permitting and environmental compliance. This is the one that surprises new operators the most. You cannot simply buy land and start stacking metal on it. You need air quality permits, water discharge permits, hazardous waste handling approvals, stormwater management plans, and a fire department permit. Before you've accepted a single vehicle, you may already need to spend $75,000 just on environmental compliance preparation, site assessments, drainage systems, concrete surfacing, and regulatory approval processes. This is not optional. Skip it, and you will face fines that dwarf whatever you saved. The third is infrastructure. Before you can operate, you need perimeter fencing, security lighting, a small office, a truck entry system, and a certified truck scale, a weighbridge, that can accurately measure vehicles weighing up to 100 tons. A certified weighbridge alone costs between $20,000 and $100,000. This scale isn't optional either. It is the central nervous system of your entire operation. Every dollar of profit you make flows through that scale. The fourth, and this is where the numbers get genuinely serious, is equipment. And here is where a lot of people first grasp the true capital intensity of this business. A scrapyard without serious equipment is just a pile of metal. Equipment is what converts that pile into money. Let's go through what you actually need to operate at a functional commercial level. A material handler, a specialized excavator fitted with a hydraulic grapple or lifting magnet, is your workhorse. It loads, sorts, and feeds every other machine in the yard. A good mid-range unit will cost you $350,000 to $850,000. Without one, you're moving metal by hand with forklifts, which is so slow it barely matters. A hydraulic shear is a massive guillotine that cuts thick structural steel into shorter mill-ready lengths. Because steel mills won't accept steel that's 30 feet long, you need to cut it down. A stationary shear will run you $800,000 to $3.5 million. A yard that relies instead on workers using gas torches can cut maybe 2 tons of steel per worker per day. The same shear does 30 tons an hour. That math decides your unit economics. A baler or logger compresses loose aluminum, copper wire, or light sheet metal into dense rectangular blocks. Mills and refineries pay more for dense, uniform bales than for loose material, because loose material is expensive to ship. A commercial baler runs $300,000 to $750,000. And then there is the machine that separates serious operations from everyone else, the industrial shredder. A hammer mill shredder is basically a massive steel box with enormous spinning hammers inside that reduce whole cars to fist-sized fragments in seconds. Large ones run on electric motors drawing several thousand horsepower. The cost of a full shredder installation, the machine itself, the downstream magnetic separation systems, the air classification equipment, runs from $2.5 million to $12 million. If you're adding it up, a modest but functional mid-sized yard that actually processes material at meaningful volume requires somewhere between $1.5 million to $5 million in initial capital, before you've bought a single pound of scrap. A large-scale operation with a shredder plant and full automation is a $15 million minimum investment. This is not the business you open with your savings account. Here is the central insight of the scrap business that most outsiders completely miss. Your selling price is not in your control. When you sell processed scrap to a steel mill or a copper refinery or an aluminum smelter, the price you get is set by global commodity markets, the London Metal Exchange, COMEX in New York, and you are a price taker, not a price setter. So where does profit actually come from? It comes from buying cheap enough that when you sell at the market price, you've captured a spread. The birth of every dollar of profit in this business happens at the intake scale, not at the outbound shipping dock. You buy from a chain of suppliers. Individual people who show up with a truck full of copper pipe. Electricians with wire scrap from a job site. Demolition contractors hauling structural steel. Industrial manufacturers with factory offcuts. Auto salvage yards with flattened chassis. Utilities selling retired transformers and cable. Your job is to buy from every one of these suppliers at a price that leaves you enough margin, after all processing costs, labor, fuel, and overhead, to still be ahead when you sell to the mill. Here's the complication. To attract volume, you need to offer competitive prices. If the yard down the road offers 8 cents more per pound for copper, your suppliers will go there. So you are constantly fighting for supply at prices that leave you thin margins. This is why the scrap business lives and dies by efficiency. The faster you can process metal from intake to outbound shipment, the lower your cost per ton. And the lower your cost per ton, the more margin you keep even while offering competitive buying prices. Now, there's one more critical element at the intake gate: sorting. Mixed, unsorted scrap is worth dramatically less than clean, sorted material. If you take in a load of mixed scrap, copper mixed with aluminum, steel mixed with brass, and send it out exactly as it arrived, you'll receive the lowest possible price for the entire load. But if you sort that same load into clean individual metals, each grade fetches its proper market price. The labor cost of sorting is real, but the value recovered is far larger. This is where handheld X-ray analyzers come in, a tool that looks like a barcode scanner but actually fires X-rays into a piece of metal and tells you in seconds whether it's 304 stainless steel or the more valuable 316 grade, whether it's pure copper or a lower value copper alloy. These devices run $20,000 to $50,000 each. Yards that use them systematically recover tens of thousands of dollars in value that lesser-equipped yards leave on the table. If you're finding this breakdown useful, consider subscribing and dropping a like. It helps more people find this kind of content and keeps us making more of it. Before we get to the financial model, there's one revenue stream that deserves its own moment. Electronic scrap, old computers, server boards, telecommunications gear, smartphones is, pound for pound, one of the richest materials your yard can process. Here's what makes it remarkable. To mine gold from the ground, geological surveys suggest that mining operations typically extract somewhere between half a gram and 13 grams of gold per metric ton of raw ore. 1 metric ton of mixed computer circuit boards, by contrast, contains roughly 250 grams of gold, 1,000 grams of silver, and about 10 grams of palladium, plus around 20% copper by weight. High-grade server boards can yield over 1,000 grams of gold per ton. This is why the term urban mining exists. The circuit boards stripped from old corporate servers are genuinely richer in precious metals than most physical gold mines in the ground. A well-run scrapyard separates electronics by board grade, low, medium, high, and super high telecom grade, and ships them to specialized precious metal refiners who use industrial smelting and electrolytic processing to extract gold, silver, and palladium at 99.9% purity. This revenue stream requires almost no special equipment beyond sorting tables and staff who can identify board grades. The margins on high-grade electronics boards can reach 70 to 80%. Most small scrapyards underinvest in this area and leave enormous money on the floor. Steel goes to electric arc furnace mini-mills. These are steel plants that don't smelt iron ore from scratch. Instead, they melt recycled scrap using powerful electrical arcs and recast it into new steel products: rebar, wire rod, structural shapes. Using recycled scrap instead of virgin iron ore consumes about 75% less energy. This is why every major steel company in America wants your processed scrap. Aluminum goes to secondary smelters. Processing recycled aluminum requires only about 5% of the energy needed to make aluminum from bauxite ore from scratch. That energy savings is enormous, and it creates permanent structural demand for aluminum scrap. Copper goes to wire rod mills and brass foundries. High-grade clean copper is often melted directly without further refining, and then there's the export market. The United States generates more scrap than domestic mills can consume, so a significant portion, roughly 30% by volume, is exported. It goes on to cargo ships at deep-water port terminals and heads to Turkey, which is the world's largest importer of ferrous scrap, and to various Asian steel-producing nations. The export price is often better than the domestic mill price, but reaching it requires scale. You need to move enough volume to fill a ship. Let's build a realistic financial picture of a mid to large scrapyard and run the actual math. Assume the yard is processing 10,000 gross tons of ferrous steel per month. That's about 120,000 tons per year. At an average selling price of $400 per ton, that's $4 million in ferrous revenue per month. Alongside that, the yard processes 500 net tons of non-ferrous metals per month: copper, aluminum, brass, electronics. At an average blended price of $3,000 per ton across the non-ferrous mix, that's another $1.5 million per month. Total gross monthly revenue, $5.5 million. Annualized, $66 million. Now let's talk about what that revenue costs. The single largest cost is buying the raw material in the first place. The yard is paying its suppliers roughly 70% of gross revenue to acquire the scrap, $3,850,000 per month. After buying, the gross profit spread is $1,650,000 per month. That sounds great, but operating costs are not done yet. Equipment maintenance, replacing hammer mill wear parts, shear blades, hydraulic hoses, costs $220,000 per month. Fuel and electricity to run shredders, material handlers, and sorting lines runs another $180,000 per month. Payroll for 35 full-time employees. Scale operators, sorters, equipment operators, mechanics, admin runs $350,000 per month. Outbound freight and logistics. Trucking processed metal to mills, rail, and export terminals costs $250,000 per month. Environmental compliance, insurance, and permit maintenance costs $80,000 per month. Facility debt service, software systems, administrative overhead runs another $70,000 per month. Total monthly operating costs, $1,150,000. Net monthly profit, $500,000. Annualized, that's $6 million in operating profit. That is a legitimate, serious business. The owner of that yard is clearing more than most corporate executives. And they're doing it from an industrial yard that everyone drives past and assumes is just noise and rust. But here is the critical constraint. Those numbers only work at volume. Because the fixed costs, equipment debt, facility costs, environmental compliance, minimum staff are largely the same whether you're processing 5,000 tons per month or 10,000. Once you're below a certain throughput threshold, the fixed cost base eats you alive. This is a volume business. Margin expansion only comes from moving more metal through the same infrastructure. Now let's talk about the thing that keeps every scrapyard owner awake at night. Steel scrap sells today for between $350 and $550 per ton. That range sounds stable enough. But you need to understand the history of this number, because it is anything but stable. In 2015, the scrap industry experienced what the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries described as the worst year in a generation. China's economy slowed dramatically. Construction output fell. Steel demand contracted globally. U.S. scrap export revenues collapsed from $33 billion in 2011 to $17.5 billion in 2015. Prices for shredded steel scrap dropped below $100 per ton in some markets. Some operators were paying sellers more per ton at intake than they were receiving at the mill, and they didn't catch it fast enough. April 2020 brought another shock. The pandemic froze manufacturing across the globe. U.S. scrap steel prices fell to approximately $190 per ton, down from $300 just months earlier. Yards that had bought large inventories at pre-pandemic prices suddenly held metal worth 40% less than what they paid. This is the volatility trap. Your buying cost is paid today. Your selling price is the market price when your processed inventory ships, which might be 30 to 60 days later. Every ton of metal sitting in your yard is an open financial position. If the market moves against you in those 30 days, you lose money on material you already bought. The most sophisticated operators hedge against this risk using financial instruments. Futures contracts on copper and aluminum traded on exchanges to lock in their selling price before the metal even arrives. Most small yard operators don't do this, which means when markets drop hard, they find out in real time, and the impact is immediate. The difference between a good year and a terrible year in this business can be 40 to 50% of revenue. The costs don't move much. The revenue swings violently. Let's walk through the operating costs that new operators systematically underestimate, because these are what turn optimistic business plans into financial problems. Environmental compliance is not a one-time expense. It is a permanent, non-negotiable operating cost. Your yard is covered in rain. That rain washes across metal piles, picking up residual oils, heavy metals, and suspended particles as it runs off the property. If that runoff enters a storm drain or waterway without treatment, you are in violation of the Clean Water Act, and the fines start at $25,000 per day. So you operate concrete drainage basins, oil water separators, sand filters, and sometimes active chemical treatment systems. This doesn't cost you once. It costs you every month, every year, air quality. If you run a shredder, you generate dust, particulate matter, and organic vapor emissions during high-speed fragmentation. You need dust collection systems, wet scrubbers, and filter housings. These are capital expenses to install and ongoing expenses to maintain. Radiation monitoring. This one surprises people. Industrial scrap sometimes contains radioactive materials from decommissioned medical or industrial equipment, gauges, calibration tools, imaging devices. If you shred radioactive material without detecting it first, the entire output batch of metal becomes hazardous waste. The decontamination and disposal cost for a mill that has processed contaminated metal runs into millions of dollars. This is why commercial yards run radiation detection portals at the intake gate. That infrastructure is not free theft prevention. Catalytic converters, copper wire, and stainless steel are among the most stolen items in American commerce. Your yard, by definition, deals in material that looks like everything a thief wants to sell. You need perimeter security, surveillance cameras, ID verification systems for every seller, mandatory non-cash payment protocols, and in some states, mandatory police database checks for certain materials. These are not optional niceties. They're legal requirements and operational necessities, equipment breakdowns. A hammer mill shredder processes cars by smashing them with manganese steel hammers rotating at high speed. Those hammers wear out. Liners wear out. Grates crack. An unplanned shredder shutdown costs you lost throughput every hour it sits idle. Plus, emergency repair costs on parts that are expensive and sometimes need to be ordered from Germany. Budgeting for equipment maintenance as a percentage of gross revenue, not as an afterthought, is the difference between yards that survive breakdowns and yards that don't. Here is a company that illustrates how this industry actually scales. Radius Recycling, which you may know by its older name Schnitzer Steel, was founded in Portland, Oregon in 1906 by a Russian immigrant named Sam Schnitzer as a company called Alaska Junk Company. His family built it for decades, processing scrap on the West Coast, gradually expanding, going public in 1993, Today, Radius Recycling operates more than 100 facilities across 25 states, runs 7 deep-water export facilities on both U.S. coasts, and generates around $2.5 billion to nearly $3 billion in annual revenue. In fiscal year 2024, the company reported revenue of $2.7 billion. But here is the part that actually tells you something useful. In 2024, Radius also reported a net loss of $266 million, $2.7 billion in sales. Net loss. The company blamed a weak domestic metals market and a contraction in U.S. manufacturing, the exact volatility dynamics we just described, hitting a company with decades of experience and a continent-spanning infrastructure network. That is not an indictment of Radius. That is what this industry does in bad years. Even the best operators with the best infrastructure get hurt when the commodity cycle turns against them. The lesson is not that Radius made a mistake. The lesson is that the scrap business doesn't give you a safe floor just because you got big. The advantage that Radius and companies like Sims Metal, EMR, and others have is that they survive those down years in ways smaller operators can't. They have deep water shipping access to global export markets, long-term contracts with steel mills, and the financial reserves to ride out a 12-month price collapse. A small independent yard with one shredder and a 30-day inventory cycle has none of those buffers. Let's be precise about what the barrier to entry actually look like if you're thinking about this seriously. You need heavy industrial zoned land. In most American cities, that land is either unavailable near population centers or extraordinarily expensive near them. Scrap yards generate noise, truck traffic, and visual impact. Municipalities don't welcome them in established neighborhoods, which means securing zoning approval often involves a significant fight. You need between $1,500,000 and $15 million in startup capital, depending on scale. This assumes you've already bought or leased the land. It covers your weighbridge, material handling equipment, baler or shredder, environmental systems, security infrastructure, and enough working capital to sustain operations for the first 3 to 6 months before you achieve consistent cash flow. And then there's the liquidity problem that kills new operators even when everything else is right. You pay suppliers today. You sell processed metal to mills and receive payment 30 to 60 days later. That gap, where you've already spent money buying scrap but haven't yet received money for selling it, requires cash reserves. A yard processing $5 million in revenue per month needs to be able to fund $500,000 to $1 million in receivables at any given time without running short. This is why the most financially dangerous moment for a scrapyard isn't when prices fall. It's when prices are rising fast, attracting lots of supply, and the yard is buying more material than its working capital can comfortably support. That's when fast-growing operations go insolvent despite seemingly strong demand. If you don't have the capital, the permits, the equipment, and the supplier relationships before you open, you are not in the scrap business. You are in the business of hoping nobody notices you're undercapitalized. Let's close with the two scenarios. The optimistic case. You run the yard described in the financial model. Ferrous prices hold above $400 per ton throughout the year. Non-ferrous volumes stay strong. Contractors are active, factories are generating scrap, the local demo market is busy. Your equipment runs without any major unplanned breakdowns. Your 35 employees all show up and perform. You net $6 million in operating profit on $66 million in gross revenue. The business is genuinely excellent. The realistic case. Ferrous prices drop $80 per ton because Chinese steel production slows and domestic mini-mills cut their buying prices. Your buying price to suppliers drops accordingly, but not by the full $80, because competitors are fighting to maintain supply volume and you match them. Your spread compresses. Simultaneously, one of your material handlers needs a major hydraulic rebuild that costs $120,000 and takes 3 weeks to fix. During those 3 weeks, you're running slower and processing less. Outbound freight rates tick up because diesel prices move. Your net profit for the year comes in at $1.5 to $2 million instead of $6 million, a 60 to 75% reduction in profit on what looks like a modest 10 to 15% change in market conditions. The difference between those 2 years is $4 million. Same infrastructure, same staff, same location. The commodity market made the decision for you. That gap is what the scrap business actually is. It's a volume game, a margin game, and a commodity game simultaneously. The people who build lasting wealth from it are the ones who scale large enough